Hello guys, this is Pinwash36 and welcome to episode 2 in the standard weather procedure video series I'm doing for you guys here, which are full weathering tutorials where I go through every single step in the process and kind of give you guys an idea about how I weather my tanks, which is something everybody asks me about. Now I'm sure many of you guys saw the last episode in this series as well. In that one I also weathered another Dragon StuG III just like this one. But in that video I had heavier mud effects, I had a winter whitewash and stuff like that. In this one here I tried to focus more on getting lighter mud effects, kind of getting some grass in there, but replicating more what I see in photos with more tonal variation. Also on the upper areas of the tank, I used hairspray chipping to get the actual red primer chip showing through and also to get wear and tear on the green camouflage pattern. So as usual, I did lots of experimentation and lots of new effects and tried new stuff like that. And I hope you guys enjoy it and hope you learned something new. Of course, this is just my way of weathering a tank. You can do it your way, you can do it a different way. I just want this to be more inspiration about how you can do certain effects and how you can use certain products and stuff like that. This isn't the only way to weather a tank, this is my way to weather a tank. So over the next hour I'm going to go through the process of first preparing the tank in the primer colors would be in the factory, then we're going to put some hairspray on that, apply the base yellow camouflage pattern, and then chip that with the hairspray chipping technique to replicate just wear and tear on the tank. Then we're going to apply more hairspray, apply a green camouflage pattern, then chip that once again to replicate a kind of field applied camouflage pattern that's not as strong a paint layer as the base color of the tank. Then we're going to go into an oil pin wash, some oil dot streaking effects and stuff like that. Then of course we have to go into the actual mud effects and dusty effects in the lower areas of the tank as well. If you have any questions or comments or would like to give me an idea about what I could do a video on in the future, then please post in the comments below. I always read through them all. Thank you very much for watching and I do hope you enjoy the video. So let's get into it. To begin, I painted the tank in a base primer color to replicate what it would be like in the factory. That was my mentality at the beginning here. I wanted to completely get the tank set up like it would be right before they applied the yellow base color. And then we could expose some stuff with hairspray chipping. So the base color in the tank is a about half and half mix of XF9 and XF4, which gives a nice primer red color. The heat resistant primer on the barrel was done with just XF69 NATO black. And the track primer is a mix of about half and half XF72 and XF69. And I did this on the spare tracks as well as the full running track links. So to begin, let's start by painting the tools with the colors they would be. So my idea was to paint the tools on the vehicle and then replicate them having been sprayed over in the factory, which is something I'm not too sure about, but it's unknown right now if the tools are applied later or before painting. So we're going to go with before painting just because it looks cool, that's what I believe. So I'll begin by painting the toe cables and all the metal areas of the tools with AK720 rubber tires. Make sure you get the ends of the eyelets here as well. These are part of the toe cable, so don't miss this. Also paint the S-hooks, the axe head, the starter crank over here as well. And I know this color is rubber tires, but I just like it for metal. So as well we have to paint the sledgehammer, the crowbar, the shovel. The fire extinguisher is not red, it's metal, dark gray. And also the wire cutters over here. And then we begin by painting the compressed paper grips, not Bakelite, compressed paper grips of the wire cutters here. I begin with XF9 as the base color, because these were a dark red color. And then I kind of stipple on some of this AK717 wrought brown. So I just kind of filter this color on here just to get it like a little bit of a texture going, because these are just paper. The little knobs at the very, very end, those are Bakelite, but the grips, everybody says they're Bakelite, they're not, they're compressed paper that was dyed red. Now we're going to paint the wooden areas of the tools with Panzerrace's 310 Old Wood. I think this color is perfect for the German tool color for wood. So we paint the axe handle over here, the sledgehammer handle, the jack block over here as well. And then we're also painting the shovel handle and the handles on the barrel cleaning rod up there on the engine deck. And also I stippled this a little bit over the wire cutter handles as well. Now I also did this here, this is kind of unnecessary. I stippled on XF72 to kind of get a wooden grain texture kind of effect going, and then because the chips of these that were exposed are so small, this had no effect at all. You just saw a single color basically on the chips. And I mean, if you're painting your tools after the base color of the tank, then you can probably do this to give you a little bit of a texture, but if you're doing it the way I'm doing it here, then hairspray chipping over this, don't bother, this was unnecessary. And now here is our vehicle in the primer colors. You can see I also painted the jack with the metal color as well. And this is how I believe the tank would have been in the factory right before they applied the yellow base color. People have their own opinions, but this is how I do it. You can do it differently, it'll all work out fine. So now we're going to apply some hairspray as a release agent to get base color chipping effects in the dark yellow. I'm using this brand here. This is Tresemé's Extra Fine Mist Firm Control. It's what Michael Rinaldi uses in his books, so that's what I'm going to use, because if it works for him, it'll work for me. And I'm applying 2 thin coats from about arm's length away, letting the first coat dry before I apply the second one. If you apply too heavy a coat, the chips will be really, really massive and it won't look realistic. So you just want to apply 2 thin coats. If you do 2 thin coats, it'll be enough, trust me. And when you see this kind of sheen on the model, that's a good idea that you have enough on there. It's almost like a gloss coat almost, but not that shiny. I leave the hairspray to dry for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I begin by applying the base color of the tank, which in this case was just XF60 Dark Yellow. I didn't use my special 20 color mix as usual, I just went simple with this one. And I thinned it about 50% with the X28 thinner by Tamiya, which is the alcohol-based thinner. Usually I'd use a lacquer thinner because that lets the paint spray smoother, I find, and also makes a much firmer, harder coat. But also that wouldn't let it be chipped by the hairspray. So we have to do alcohol-based thinner or even water here. But the paint sprays better with Tamiya thinner than does with water in it. So I'm just applying an overall thin coat, not too heavy, nothing too special, just an overall base coat of the tank. So I've got a cup of water here and some instruments to do the chipping effects with. I've got a shish kebab stick and some old scruffy brushes here. And basically I wait about 5 minutes from when I apply the paint to when I start the chipping process. I basically paint it, clean my airbrush, and then come right back and start. The longer you wait, the harder it'll be to chip. So I get my brush a little bit wet with some water, and then I just start rubbing at the edges, and you'll see it starts to expose the red color underneath. This works by basically the water soaks through the paint, encounters the hairspray, which is water soluble because you can wash it out of your hair obviously, and then that basically dissolves the hairspray, and then that exposes the underlying color of red, which is the primer color for us. So just like rub it edges gently. In some places you'll see me using the shish kebab stick to trace panel edges. This I find just kind of helps to initiate the chipping effects. But don't go too heavy. I know that my chipping effects here are probably heavier than they should be in real life, but it's just kind of your style. You can do less than me, but I'm still keeping it pretty light, I think, considering what I've seen on some models basically. So here I'm doing some more little damage. You can just kind of poke at it with the stick, then rub, and you'll get like little chips starting for like scrapes and scuffs and stuff like that. When doing this, just think about where the crew would walk around, so or where the tank would hit things. Like if it goes through, a bush, branches scrape the sides. So if you have like side skirts, scrape them up like horizontally. Over here near the hatches, the crew's walking around lots and they're dragging ammo boxes and stuff up. So chip those as well. Exposed edges and just like raised details would also get kicked around and scraped up a lot more. So this is actually as easy as it looks. I just get my brush a little bit wet with some water, and then you start rubbing gently, and then the chips just appear magically. So I think this is actually a lot easier and faster than doing the chips by painting them on with a brush, because you can get much finer chips with this, I think. It's also a lot faster because you just kind of like paint it and then go and then the paint comes off, so it's definitely something else you can try. So here you can see I'm chipping the tools because I want to expose those colors I painted them with. So the same kind of stuff, just rub them over. The chips obviously are used a lot more than just like other things in the tank, so you can chip them up pretty good. Then once again here I'm just thinking about chipping exposed edges and things like that that would get hit by stuff that's on the back of the tank, the crew walking around. And of course I know my chipping is heavier than it should be a little bit. You barely ever see any chipping in photos. Now here's something else I did that people are going to definitely hate, but it's kind of cool. So whenever you see a muzzle brake that's black, is it the soot, or is it the paint being burned off by the heat exposing the barrel primer underneath? We don't know, but I think that, I was talking with some guys, I think that this might be a possibility. So I just did it just because I want to, and I want to make people get all angry about stuff they shouldn't get angry about, because that's kind of funny. So I'm just doing it the exact same way as the rest of the tank, just chipping it up with a little brush here. And the final result looks a lot like what I've seen in some photos. It wouldn't make sense for soot to be extending far down the barrels, so I'm not too sure about how it was in real life, but this looks cool. And here is a result of the hairspray chipping techniques. As you can see, it basically is a nice, easy way to chip the tank up. It's really easy. It took me maybe like an hour to do this total, including the painting. And overall, it's very convincing. If the chips are too big, you can obviously just go back with the base color tank, XF60 in this case, and then just take a small brush and kind of paint back around the chips and fix them up. I did that in like 2 areas here, but overall I was really happy with how it came out. I know it's heavier than it should be. People are going to say, yeah, well, it's my tank, you can do it less on your own tank if you want to. And as you'll see, the rest of the weathering effects really tone this down, all the pigments, the oil filter, the Pinwash, and of course the camouflage pattern, which we're going to look at applying next. So once again, I wanted to do some hairspray chipping of this camouflage pattern. My idea was to make it replicate maybe a camouflage pattern that was applied in the field by the crew, and then was kind of a lighter, more distempered paint color, and so it was kind of scuffed up as they walked around and stuff like that. So I'm using my same airbrush here, which is a Badger 105, and I've got a much smaller needle with it. I'm using that. It's probably hard to tell, but the one on the bottom is a finer needle. So once again, hairspray coating. I only did 1 coat of hairspray actually on this one, because it was very, very thin, the paint. It was like super thin lines, but I only really thought I needed 1 coat of this hairspray, so we put that on. And then we start applying the paint. So I'm using the XF65 here, once again thin with about like 90% at least of the X28 thinner, and I'm spraying at like 5 or 8 psi. I'm not good at camouflage pattern, but somehow I did this pretty well. So I'm just basically, most of the painting was on the paper towel because I wanted to check the lines, check to make sure it wasn't going to spatter. I'm just gently kind of layering in these lines, and as you can see, I'm painting it over top of the chips because I want to replicate. The tank was in service for some time, it got chipped up a little bit. Then the crew applied the camouflage pattern, so they would apply it over the chips, over the camouflage, over the tools, everything like that, and then obviously that gets chipped up as they walk around. So I'm applying chips in different areas than I did with the red ones as well. I saw a photograph of a tank that had the spare tracks on the side like this, and then they painted the camouflage colors over top of them even though they were still the track primer color. So I did that here just because I thought it looked cool. And we're also just applying it over top of the tools over here, you can see, because I don't care, the crew wouldn't care, they're just trying to camo up their tank. You'll notice that I'm doing lots of test spraying on the paper towels in the background here. I think that over 2/3 of the paint I sprayed was on that, because I was constantly checking to make sure that it was gonna not spatter, because that's the worst thing that happens. You aim the airbrush at the model and then it just spatters and basically messes it up. Of course, you could just kind of chip that away because we have hairspray on it, but still, I want to do a good job, and somehow I managed to avoid actually getting any spatter. So over the course of the 4 hours it took me to paint this camouflage pattern, just the green, just paint it, it was 4 hours. I had to change constantly the pressure and the thinner ratio of the airbrush because over time the ratio or it would just kind of get a little bit wonky and it wouldn't spray as nicely, so I had to kind of just tweak it a little bit. As you can see, this is the result. It took me some time, but I definitely think it was worth it. And once again, we're going to chip this right away basically. So I've got my same brushes here, a cup of water, and I've also got this new brush. This is a very soft kind of, I don't even know what type of brush it is, but it's very soft and gentle. So I figured this would be good for actually doing less like accurate chipping and more just like overall wear and tear, and just kind of working down on surfaces to kind of simulate the crew just walking over and just slowly eroding the paint. So over here I'm just chipping it up with my shish kebab stick a little bit to begin the chips, and then I just kind of scrub on with my soft brush here. And then I just kind of slowly got some little scrapes and scuffs going. I didn't want to be too hard on this because otherwise it's going to get all chipped away and the camouflage is going to be invisible, so I picked distinct areas where I think the crew would walk the most and then focus more on those areas. And of course, the heaviest areas of the red chipping, I also made sure I chipped off the camouflage color on that because those areas are obviously most frequently chipped up, so I wanted to make sure that they were chipped up with the camouflage color as well. Some vertical scrapes like this really replicate just the effect of maybe the crew dragging ammo boxes or jerry cans up. And then smaller areas of chipping are obviously more for actual use by the crew, them touching it or walking over it. And over here you can see, as I said, I'm also chipping over these areas because this is where the commander walks up, so I figured it's used a lot, so we got to chip the camo color there as well. And I think if anybody can look at the model close enough when they're just viewing it and they see that there's the chipping effects of the yellow, and then some places that's actually painted over with the green, not chipped, and then the green is chipped in other areas, it kind of Makes it look like maybe the camouflage has been applied later by the crew, and obviously it's been worn down in different areas, and just kind of adds to the history of the vehicle and makes it look a little more interesting. Things like this really bring some life to your vehicle. I don't know if it's that obvious when people look at it, but I just had fun doing it, so. As long as you have fun with the weathering process, and as long as you like the end result, I think it came out good. And here you can see I'm doing the chipping kind of like I did on the upper surfaces with the red. I'm using a scruffy brush here. And here is the end result of the camouflage pattern. I think it came out very, very well, considering that I'm not that experienced at all with an airbrush. I'm still basically a beginner at this stuff. And if anybody else is looking at this and they think that they're a beginner and they want to see how I did this, like I said, just thin the paints down, be careful, and be patient. I did lots of practice on the spare T-34 turret I had next to me, and also lots of practice on the paper towels just to make sure that my mix of paint was good, and that I wasn't going to get any spatter or runs or anything like that. And that, combined with lots of patience and slowly building up the camouflage lines and thin layers, is what allowed me to pull this off. So if I can do it, anybody can do it. You can do it. And don't be afraid to just try it, because experience and practice will make you much better at this stuff. That's how you progress in modeling. So next up, I decided that I wanted to add some interest to the back of the tank, because it was looking a little bit boring back there. So I decided to add a T-34 stowage bin that I figured the crew might have captured off a vehicle that was knocked out. So I cobbled together a spare one for my stowage bin, and I also added some weld seams to the bottom, as you can see there. That was just the stretch sprue technique. I'll attach a card up in the top here to see my video on that. And to replicate the 4BO chipping, I basically did hairspray chipping here. First a dark green color, then hairspray, then a light green color. Because 4BO, the Russian tank green color, was a paint and primer in one, so once it chips it just kind of gets darker because it's just a darker layer of itself, basically a deeper, more matte layer of itself. And then on the welds here, since they're not painted, they're a shiny metal, so I use this Citadel Ironbreaker layer color. It's what I use for metallic paints. You'll see it again later. It works pretty well. And then I just put some super glue on it, and I stuck it on the back of the tank. I always aim to do this on every single one of my tanks. Add a unique feature or two, just to add some interest to the vehicle. And on this vehicle, that would be the camouflage pattern being chipped in different areas than the red chipping already exists, and also, of course, the stowage bin on the back. This way, when people look at the tank, they see those things, and they think, how did that happen? What's the story behind that? And things like this just add more visual interest to the vehicle, and make it more of an appealing piece. Next up, let's apply an oil pin wash to the tank. I'm using the Wilder oil colors here, Black Night and Brown Shadow, for the actual colors of the oil pin wash. And I've got some of the Wilder enamel thinner here to thin them down. As for brushes, I have this very, very small, I think it's a 10/0 brush. That's to apply the actual pin wash. And then I've also got this larger one here. That's to do some cleanup. Now the Wilder oils are a lot easier to use than artist oils because you don't have to soak the linseed oil out of them. So I'm just applying them in my palette here. So this is about a 50-50 mix of the two. Nothing too special. I'm just trying to make a nice dark brown color. Make sure you mix it up well to make sure the color's right. And then I'm applying some of the thinner here to thin it down. As you can see, I'm using my paintbrush as a pouring guide to just help control the stream. That's something you can try. It's a really good technique. And here I'm checking the consistency. You want to be very, very thin, but not overly thin that's not opaque anymore. So that's a pretty good idea right there. There's some margin of error there. It doesn't really matter as long as it flows well. So now we apply the pin wash to basically every single detail in the tank. Every single panel line, weld seam, rivet, anything like that. Put the pin wash on it and it'll really help to accentuate the detail. So the whole point of a pin wash is really to, as I said, accentuate details and also to make fake shadows. It also helps to simulate maybe like built up grime and crap in the crevices. And overall just makes the tank look a lot larger than it is by making the details more apparent. Oils are really good to use for a pin wash because you can see that if you thin them properly, they really flow really well. Like you just hit them on the seam line and they'll just kind of shoot down along the details. And also they're really easy to clean up, and they should never really technically dry. So afterwards, if you see an issue, you can always just get a little bit thinner on your brush and go in there and clean it up. So over here I'm cleaning up some excess. I've just got my brush here, which is not even wet with any thinner. The oil paint is still a little bit wet because I put it on like 2 minutes ago in that area, so I just take my brush and gently rub at the areas where I want to clean it up and kind of just push it towards the weld seam itself. I always get asked this question in these videos, do I gloss coat or anything like that before I put these on? The answer is no. I never gloss coat, never matte coat, never seal, never varnish, anything like that. I'm just putting this on over the paint. oils are not really volatile, the thinner I'm using isn't really volatile, it shouldn't have any effect on the paint because it paints acrylic and it's strong. Even with the hairspray on there, it shouldn't really have any effect. A lot of people like to do this over a satin or a gloss coat because it helps it flow better. But as you can see here, it's flowing pretty well considering that this is like matte or mostly matte paint. It's just straight over the paint, and it'll flow nicely because it's oil paints. If you thin them to the right consistency, they'll just flow nicely. So you don't need a gloss coat or anything like that. It's a myth, but it can definitely help you if you want to be extra sure you don't have any problem with the earlier effects or earlier paints. You can always do it if you want to. No harm will come from that, but I'm saying you don't need to do it. For me, it's just a waste of time because I have to, apply it and let it dry for a day. I just like to basically paint it and then just start putting the oils on. It doesn't really matter. I've never had any issue with oils or enamels or anything like that messing up my acrylic-based paints. On the engine deck here, exactly the same thing, just applying the Pinwash to every single weld seam, every single panel edge for the hatches, every single rivet. It's really easy. I'll let you guys just watch and see how we do it here. Now this here is a good indicator of how well the oil Pinwash should flow. As you can see, I just tap it on these details and it'll just flow all over them, right down the weld seams. And now looking at the tank, you can suddenly see how all the details pop out a whole bunch more. All the weld seams, rivets, everything like that just kind of jumps it at you. The details are more apparent, the tank looks larger than it is, and I also find that sometimes this helps to blend in the chipping effects with the base color of the tank. So in this case, the red chipping blends in more now that we have this dark brown oil Pinwash on all the details of the tank. So that highlighting of the details and blending in of the chipping effects, combined with the fact that this also helps to initially build up some of the kind of dusty, built-up crap we're going to apply later on the tank. This is why I think that an oil Pinwash is probably the most effective weathering technique, even though it's also probably the most basic. So I think everybody should do this in the tank because, it's really easy, but it's really, really good. It was at this moment where I realized that I'd forgotten to put on any markings for this tank, so that was a bit of an uh-oh moment, but let's do it now. So I'm going to use some basic Tamiya paints here, as well as this DN Models mask for German crosses. As you can see, it basically has a whole bunch of different sizes of markings on there, so we're just going to use some of the basic size German crosses. That's all I'm going to put on this tank. As you can see, I've used them before. So I peel them off the sticky sheet because they're sticky and they're reusable, and I'll just put them on where I want. Just find some reference photos or use the actual instruction manual because that often has a painting and marking guide for the kit. I chose this area here because I saw a cool photo. And then I just basically put on some painter's masking tape for like walls because that works and it's cheap. And then I paint on the black area of the cross with this XF69 NATO Black from Tamiya. Let that dry for, 20 minutes or so. And then we line up the white part of the mask, which is a little bit tricky, but you just basically line it up and then you poke it on, make sure it stays on. As you can see, I also helped to remove the stowage bin I put on the back there earlier, so I just pop that off and put it back on later. Then I put on more of the painter's masking tape here. And then we paint the white areas with Tamiya XF2 flat white. And it looks pretty good. I like to use the masks here because there's no decal film issues. It's a lot faster, and it looks kind of like the crew applied it. It's a little bit less perfect than a decal. As I'm sure many of you know, I'm a big fan of oil paints because they're very versatile and you can do basically anything with them. So what I want to do here is I want to add more kind of interest to the tank by doing some gentle streaks, some kind of discoloration, and just make them be more tones to the yellow of the tank. So we're going to do a dot filter with some oil paints. So here's everything I need to do the dot filter effect. As you can see, I once again have a whole bunch of the Wilder oils here. I like them a lot. They're a really good oil paint. They dry fast and they dry very, very matte. Artist oils work fine as well, but I'm using these ones here because they're a little more effective for modeling. I'm using the Wilder enamel thinner once again to do the actual blending of the dots of oil paint. As for brushes, I'm using the same ones I use for the Pinwash. So I've got a 10/0 to apply the dots, and then I've also got this larger soft one to do the blending of the streaks. When doing the dot filter effect, it's very important that you separate the oil paints out from the actual linseed oil in the tube. If you leave the linseed oil in there, it won't dry basically ever, or take a week or so. The Wilder ones, it separates pretty well, as you can see. Basically just pour it out and you'll get the linseed oil coming out first, and then you can actually pour out the oil paint itself after. With the wilder oils, I can start right away, but if I was using artist oils, I would wait probably about 5 hours for the linseed oil to properly soak out of them. So we begin by just applying little dots of the colors to the tank. I put them in random areas, don't have any pattern to it, you want it to be random and ununiform, just like weathering is in real life. I use mainly the dark yellow, the mid yellow, and the light buff colors on the tank for this dot filter effect. Seeing as it's maybe like 10% green, I barely use any of the green oil paint at all, and the brown one we use later to actually make some kind of built up dusty effects. As you can see, I'm just basically applying dots of all three colors here, all three of the yellows. Then we let them dry for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we get my brush very, very, very lightly damp with the thinner. I'm wiping like as much out as I can, and then we gently streak up and down, preferably down, but it's hard to get that on camera at the angle I'm working at, so I'm just going up and down. And then we gently blend out these streaks. Don't blend them out until they're invisible. You want to blend them out until they're very, very faint. As always, you'll get better with experience. You'll be able to tell when you've blended them to the right point. If you blend them too much, you can just apply more dots and do it again later, so it doesn't really matter. Oil paints, these ones dry pretty quick, the wilder ones. If you're doing this with standard artist oil paints, I would wait at least a day before you do another coat. Or any other weathering for that matter, because they take a while to dry fully. Every once in a while I take my brush off and you can see it disappear for a second. I'm just wiping it off on the paper towel beside me because I want to remove any excess paint from the brush. I'm really just trying to blend these out, not really smear the paint around, just I wanted to blend them up and down into very, very subtle streaks. In some areas, like on the engine deck for example, I actually try to apply the darker colors lower down, so just on the actual panels themselves, and then I actually apply lighter oil dots to the upper areas, so the toolbox here, as well as those 5 little elevated bits. And this just kind of helps to get some kind of tonal variation and highlighting in there. So very similar to what you do with color modulation on the airbrush, but I'm doing it here with oils because it's easier that way and I have lots more control. So here's where I'm using the dark brown oil paint. I'm applying in a very similar way little dots around the areas where I think the crew would walk around the most. So focusing it mainly around areas where I already have chipping, and I'm blending it in the exact same way. So a little bit of thinner on my brush here, a very, very small amount. I'm trying to just replicate maybe some dusty built up crap that the crews basically put in there as they walk around. So I'm focusing around the hatches and also around the cupola here, and just like I said, areas where it's already chipping, so emphasizing where the crew walks around and messes up the tank. And here is the result of the built up dust and also the gentle streaks we've done on the tank. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but in person the streaks are very, very faint, but they're visible. And of course you can definitely see the dust here, which is just kind of made the tank look a little more used. We also have that kind of highlighting effect on the back here, as I was talking about earlier, and it's also visible a little on the top here as well. Maybe you can see that maybe the edge of the hatches there, the top panel, the piece that moves around the gun sight, and also the cupola are a little bit more yellow because I use a little bit more of the yellow oil paints on them. And that just makes them pop a little bit more, emphasizes some of the angles and just all the different panels and pieces to the top of the tank, and adds some more visual interest. So at this point, the top of our tank is completely weathered. We've done the actual base painting, the chipping of the camouflage, we've done the Pinwash, the oil dot filter, everything like that. Now we're going to move on to the bottom of the tank and do all the built up muddy, dusty, dirty effects down there. So let's move on to that. Here's all the products I'll be using to make the muddy and dusty effects in the tank. Pretty straightforward, but I've added a few to my mix this time to add some more interesting features to the tank. To begin, I have this Wilder Dark Russian Fine Textured Earth. This is just to build up some initial muddy textures. I'm using 2 pigments here, a dark pigment and light pigment, as well as a enamel effect here. This is for the general kind of layering of the muddy and dusty effects. This is new. This is the Vallejo Environment Acrylic Crushed Grass effect. It came out really well in this tank, so I'm going to be using it more in the future for sure. I'm also using X22 Clear to make some glossy wet effects, and some Citadel Ironbreaker to make the metallic highlights on the tracks. And once again, we'll be using this Wilder oil paint to make some dusty accumulations on the fenders and stuff like that. So as usual, I like to begin by applying some of this Wilder Dark Russian Textured Earth. This is more for like an initial layer of the texture, so this mostly gets covered up. The color isn't too important. It looks kind of green in the jar, but once it dries it gets more brown. And this is just to kind of build up those initial muddy textures that'll be covered up later with the pigments and everything like that. So this is just like the base effect. So I'm applying, as you can see, to the upper areas where I think that most of the mud would accumulate from falling from the tracks as they go over the top rung. So mud isn't really kicked up and built up, it's more just dropped off the tracks. So I'm trying to keep it at the top, and keep in mind that the suspension arms here, the swing arms, they will move up and down, and that'll knock off any mud that's built up on them. So I'm trying to keep it lighter than it was in the last StuG in the video. Also apply it to the top here. I mean, this area is basically invisible after the tracks are put on, so I'm just trying to make like a hint of some muddy effects up there. It's not too important. Since this is an acrylic effect, I can actually get in there with some water and blend it down before it fully dries. So maybe about 5 minutes after I applied it, I just wait a little bit, and then I start to blend it in here, and this helps to kind of smoothen the transitions. And I can also kind of scrape away anything that's too heavy and built up in areas where I don't want it to be. Of course, we'll be applying some pigments over top of this, so the actual blending of the color isn't too important. I'm just trying to blend in the texture and smooth out the edges. Now I'm beginning to layer on some of these enamels and pigments. So I'm using a very short, stiff brush here. This is a 1/8 inch angular shader. I use it for blending pigments and oils and basically everything. I like it a lot. I'm just stippling on these pigments over the areas where I already have the texture earth product on there. So I'm beginning with the dark pigment, applying that lower down. And of course, any places where the texture shows through is fine because it's already a dark color. This doesn't need to be too perfect. I just want to actually blend in the stark edge of the mud effects there from the textured earth with the base color of the tank. And also apply some more different colors in there and just break it up a little bit. Now I do the same thing but using the lighter color here. I know it says dark European terrain, but it's definitely a lighter color. And this is what I'm using a little higher up to simulate some dust and some more dry effects. And this also helps to blend in the actual color of the tank, the base yellow color, with the darker dusty and dirty effects. And some areas you can see here I'm just streaking it a little bit the way I apply it. That's just to kind of make some interesting streaks and stuff like that. You can be random, you can just put these anywhere you want. The only bad thing about weathering you can do is to make it too uniform and too perfect. You want it to be random and have some interesting areas. And here I'm doing more of that streaking again. I begin by applying the enamels here. Now I'm applying this over top of the pigments. This is for the layering process. People might think this is kind of weird how I apply pigments and then just throw enamels on top of that, and then more pigments and then more enamels and stuff like that, but this I find helps to build up a nice tonal variation and some different kind of textures and pigments and everything like that. It helps to just break it up and bring more tones in there and makes it more interesting. So I'm not doing this everywhere, I'm just doing it kind of at the lowest areas and the areas where I want the effects to be a little bit darker and maybe more wet looking. So areas where I think water would accumulate, water would streak down. Also the lower areas just because that's closer to the ground, which is wet. And also the areas that have the heaviest built up mud effects. And now I'm applying the same pigment again, the dark one, and I'm stippling this right on top of the wet enamels. I literally just put the enamels on and then begin this. And the enamels will help to actually hold this on because they're still wet and they'll kind of absorb into it and dry. And once again, the exact same thing, but now I'm using the lighter pigment here. And I'm applying it over top of both the pigments I already have on there. And the enamel effect's still wet. I'm just kind of throwing it on higher up and also on the suspension arms here. And just, this is my idea for how I do it. I just put on different colors, different layers, different effects. And then when you do all this layering, they'll blend together automatically. And then once again here, oh, we're putting on more enamels once again. And I'm doing it the same spots as before, but this is more of like a controlled final application. So I pick a few areas on the suspension arms here where I want them to be a little bit wet lower down. And then now we're putting some pigment on top of this just to make it a little more opaque, give it a little bit more of a texture because pigments can often do that. And this also helps to blend it in with the drier areas because it'll just kind of smooth the transitions. Here I'm going to do some speckling. I'm using the exact same enamel I just used on the actual effects down there. I've got a much longer, thinner brush here. I'm just going to take my finger and gently flick at the bristles to get some very, very fine spatter effects in the tank. This helps to kind of blend in the wetter, darker areas of the enamel effects with the kind of drier, dusty effects. You don't have to do this, and it's very easy to overdo this, trust me, but it really helps to just kind of add some interest there, make it look like the tank's been going through some poses or something like that. And basically, this spot here, you can see the result of the layering effects. You can see we have heavier areas, we have areas that look kind of wet almost, we have areas that look kind of a little bit more dry, we have some streaks going, some dry streaks, some wet streaks. Now we're going to actually emphasize some of the wet streaks by applying some X22 paint by Tammy. This is just straight up gloss basically. I'm using the small brush I just used for the speckling, and I'm applying it to the areas that I think are where there should be the most wet effect. So the heaviest areas of the mud where the water will accumulate most, and the areas where I want it to run down the tank. So don't do this to every single one of the streaks you've done. You want some streaks to be that dusty color, you want some streaks to be of the enamel color, so they're kind of like a dark, dirtier color, but they're not fully dry yet, and then you want these ones here which are like very, very fresh and wet. And also, don't overdo this. It's very easy to overdo effects like this. You want this to be controlled. You just want to emphasize some areas where we want them to be a little bit more wet and maybe greasy looking. For instance, over here on the shock absorber, I'm applying a little bit of gentle streaking of it. This might be the wet effects, this might be actually grease. It doesn't really matter, it just looks kind of cool. I think that looks really, really awesome actually when it's just dry. As you can see, I kept it refined, kept it only to the areas where I wanted to have a little bit of shiny effect there just to make it look like it's fresh and wet. And overall, the tank looks pretty nicely weathered down here. I think I toned this down a little bit more than I did in the last one. Blends nicely with the base coat of the tank, and you can definitely see the yellow still showing through the sides. So usually I would have left it there, but I had this new Vallejo acrylic product on my bench, so I really want to try this out. This is their crushed grass effect. It's meant to simulate, obviously, some grass that's been caught up in the tank. And when you look at photos, you often do actually see this. Bits of grass caught up in the tracks and caught up in the mud of the tank. People often don't really do this to the tank, so I think this is a cool effect. The product itself is basically just like a thin paste, a little bit satin finish to it, so once it dries it still looks a little bit shiny and wet. There isn't much actual like muddy texture to this, so I'm not using it as part of the mud mix, I'm applying it on top of the mud. I'm keeping this mainly around the upper surfaces of these exposed bits, mainly where it would fall off the tracks as they go over the top rung. Same thing with the mud effects. I'm just trying to keep it in areas where I think it would most likely accumulate. Seeing as mud didn't really get scraped up along the sides very much, except for around the bottom, any mud you see on the top and the sides really is just what's fallen off the tracks from above. Overall, I think this effect is very, very convincing, so I'm definitely going to be doing it more in the future. Now on the wheels, it's basically the exact same thing. I'm just layering on the same two pigments and the same enamel effect in just a kind of a random order to get a built-up kind of multi-layer accumulation of just different textures and different colors. And you can be really as messy as you want, because if you do too much, you can just get in there with a little bit of enamel thinner afterwards and just kind of clean it up, because it'll thin down both the enamels and it'll also kind of reactivate the pigments, and that'll help you just clean up anything you don't like. I also added some of the same grassy effect. Same thing as I did in the hull. Basically, I'm just putting it in there to replicate some grass that's been caught up in the mud. If you look at some photos of StuGs, you can definitely often see that there are grassy effects and just kind of stuff like that caught up in the dry sprocket here. So we'll just put it on there. I had a photo next to me here that I was using for reference for how I was applying the grassy effects. If anybody wants to see these photos, I can just send them to you. I'll try to post a link in the comment section or something like that for you guys. There were a few unique photos I was using for reference when I was actually doing all the weathering effects in this tank. So after the grass is on, I begin by stippling on some of the same dark brown pigment as before. And then we're going to actually go in with some of the dusty effect here and kind of blend in those muddy effects with the actual base yellow color of the tank on the wheel here. So pretty straightforward, just kind of blending it in, stippling it on. If it's too heavy, you can always just, as I said earlier, get in some enamel thinner on there and just kind of wipe it away. But I was actually really happy with how this came out, so this is how it looks in the end. I think it looks pretty good. Exactly what I was aiming for. Now on the wheels here, it's pretty much the same thing once again, but I actually have a little bit of a unique way about how I apply the pigments to maintain a little bit of a texture and separation. So first I apply some of the enamel effect, and then I apply the pigments by doing this. I'm tapping my finger against the brush to kind of knock off little bits of pigment on the wheels. If I were to just take my brush and the pigment and then just kind of wipe it on right after I put the enamels on, the pigments will just kind of melt in and just paint the wheel brown. If you do it this way, you'll get little separated areas with a little bit more texture to them. And then afterwards, when you do a little bit of blending and just kind of pushing with your brush, that'll help to blend them in and kind of tone them down a little bit. But you'll have more, like I keep saying, separated areas. You'll have little bits of each color pigment like I'm doing here with 2 pigments, rather than just a big kind of blob of one color. So I just do this basically to maintain a little bit more texture to the wheels and the mud effects in there. And of course we have to apply some grass to maintain what we've been doing in the rest of the tank. For how this is accumulated in the tank, I looked at some photos, like I was talking about earlier. I found some photos of Panzer III, stuff like that with grass in the wheels. That's my reference there. If that's how it worked in real life, that's how I do it here. Kind of looks like I got caught up kind of around the wheel, interestingly. So I just did that here. And also we do a little bit more blending of the pigments on top of the grass here, just to kind of mix everything together a little bit more. Now for the tracks. I begin by doing a kind of dry brushing effect with this Citadel Ironbreaker color. Once again, earlier the tracks were painted with a base color of 50/50 XF69 and XF72, which gives a very, very dark brown color, which I believe is what the track primer was basically looking like. This effect recreates some metallic highlights you see on these surfaces here. Often these are basically polished by a tank going over a road and stuff like that. Now for the actual weathering effects using pigments and all that good stuff, I begin by applying an initial layer using the enamel effect, same things before. And overall it's the same process as the hull. Next we apply the pigments, both in the same area, both in different areas, back and forth, keeping it random. You want different areas, you want some darker areas, some lighter areas, to replicate areas that had maybe more mud built up on them, so they've taken longer to dry, so they're still wet. And of course after this we go in and put some of the same grassy effect on there, the Vallejo stuff, that I think looks really, really good. Just putting it on in random areas, don't put it on every single link, put it in spread out areas. You can also keep it more around the darker wet areas, because I guess the grass would stay wet, make the mud around it wet. As you can see, I'm kind of putting it on in a horizontal way just to simulate it being kind of crushed into the tracks as it go along. And then I also put some of the same X22 gloss paint in some of the darkest areas of the enamels and the pigments. And overall we get this nice kind of varied effect that matches what we've done on the wheels and the tracks. I'm very happy with how it came out overall. So some of the new things I tried here, which were the gloss paints and the grassy effects, are things that I think look really, really good and effective. So I'm going to be definitely doing them more in the future. A very important thing to do, which I think can either make or break your tank, is to have the mud effects look unified with the rest of the colors of the tank. Try to use similar pigments for the lower areas of the tank, then the pigments of the actual oil paints you've done some blending with on the upper areas and replicate some dust there. Similar colors to the Pinwash you did, similar colors to the base color of the tank, so in this case a darker yellow color. If you keep everything like that, the whole tank will look unified and looks like it goes well together. In a few areas here I also did some touch-ups, so I decided to add some more dusty effects on the fenders. For this I'm using the same Wilder oil paint I was using earlier on the upper areas of the tank to do the dusty effects. And basically we're just doing the same thing here, so I apply a little bit of it, and then I just kind of blend it in right away by just stippling it. I don't really need any thinner here because I'm just basically putting it right on and then blending it right away so it's still wet and fresh. So I'm just stippling it gently, rubbing it around to just kind of get that nice dusty effect going. Over here as well near the hatch I figured, well, the loader's probably going to get out with his dirty boots, so let's add some very, very gentle streaks here. Just going to emphasize where he walks around. And we're just doing the exact same thing here. I'm applying a little bit of oil paint and then blending it right away. Just kind of rubbing it around, don't need any thinner on there. I also added a few other areas to the grassy effects here on the wheels where I wanted it to look like it maybe had just been lifted off the tracks as the wheels went over them. I also put on a few little areas of grass on the upper surfaces of the superstructure where we already had a little bit of that dust from the oil paints. And then we actually apply a little bit more of the gloss and some oil paints and some pigments on the front here to make some streaks from where like the driver might get in the front hatch here. I saw a photo of a cool Sturmhaubitze that had stuff like this on it, so I wanted to replicate that with some wet streaks on the front. Once the gloss paint is dried, you can see how it's pretty subtle until you catch it in the light, and then it kind of glares a little bit. Looks pretty cool. As a final touch, I also used some of the same pigments I used for the mud effects in the lower areas to just do a little bit of subtle dusting on top of the spare tracks here. I didn't want to do any rusty effects because tanks never really got rusty. I just wanted to blend them in with the overall dusty effect we've gotten the entire surface of this tank. And with that, we've wrapped up the weathering process on this StuG here. So here's the final result of our weathering procedure on this vehicle. As you can probably tell, I'm very happy with how it came out as usual. I did some new experimentation with those new effects. The glossy stuff was something new for me that I learned from Adam Wilder. The grassy effects is something new. And just the overall way of doing the chipping in 2 different layers, so actually chipping the base color, then also chipping the camouflage in a different layer. Stuff like that was kind of what I think made this vehicle interesting, but they're also all new things for me. So lots of fun, lots of new stuff, lots of new learning things for me, and hopefully lots of new learning things for you. Again, I make these videos, like I said in the beginning of the video, so you guys can learn things from me, because I like weathering, it's my passion. I hope you guys like it too, and hope you learn something from watching my videos, because that's why I make them. I want to inspire you guys and kind of spread the hobby out, because this is really fun, and it's just what I love doing most. So as always, thank you very much for watching the video, and I do hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please throw them in below. People are always in there commenting and sharing their experiences in the hobby, because you have a great community on YouTube, and also I'll be in there reading through them and replying to you guys for your questions. I hope I explained everything pretty well, but of course somebody's going to ask me if I gloss coated before I did the pin wash. Like I said, I didn't gloss coat, I never gloss coat, never matte coat, never varnish, anything like that. You don't need to, but of course somebody's still going to ask me that question, because somebody always does. And of course, a big thanks also goes out to our Patreons. We have Ricky from Ryan's Painting, Sam Murphy, John Butler, Ian Susek, Richard Ward, and Rudolph Kiras, who are supporting me. And we also have Dr. EO, who supports me through PayPal, which is also really awesome. And of course, it's much appreciated for you guys doing this for me, because it allows me to buy new kits, buy new products, buy stuff like that for you guys to see in the videos, for me to do reviews of, and just give you guys ideas about what's good in the hobby, how you can do certain effects with different products. So as I said before, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. This is Pinwash 36, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye, and happy modeling.